Hello, everybody, and welcome to another brand new episode of Hey Man, It's Okay, a men's mental health podcast. I'm your host, Sky, the man without a plan.
And I'm your co-host, Ryan Heapy, licensed marriage and family therapist out of Newport Beach over here. And while I hope to bring some of my clinical psychology expertise here, everything said here is just personal and my own views and my own takes and not to be taken clinically.
Perfect. Awesome, Ryan. I'm really excited. We have another really amazing guest on today's episode. We have a motivational speaker, mental health advocate, comedian, and author of the new book, Minds Over Meetings. We welcome Kody Green to Hey Man, It's Okay. Welcome to the show, Kody.
Hey, thank you guys so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you're a really busy person. For our listeners who aren't familiar with you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Kody. When I was 21 years old, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia after a few years of struggling with addiction and incarceration. I was also raised by a mother with schizoaffective disorder. When TikTok blew up, I decided I was going to start using that platform to share my story. It went way further than I ever anticipated. I never expected to be known as the famous online schizophrenic. Here I am, and so I really just wanted to help people who had my diagnosis feel less alone in their own journeys. Because I grew up in a very small rural community where people didn't talk about mental health. They didn't talk about mental illness. It was something that people acted like was shameful. So when I was diagnosed and I watched my mom go through her diagnosis, I was just into people online and share my story and help people better understand schizophrenia and addiction.
How cool. How cool. There's so many places I want to go with this, and I'm not exactly sure where to start. What was it that kind of gave you the motivation to put this out there? This is something that people have struggled with just millennia, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And yet, I was telling you earlier how I listened to, and I encourage everybody to go on Kody's Instagram page and check out one of his pinned reels. And this is actually an audio clip that you created. Was that?
So it was an audio clip that I found and I added some voices to. So it was someone else had created an audio clip and the original creator, you can find them on TikTok through that video. But I did add some of my own audio to it to make it more real to what I experience. So it was a collaborative effort of trying to make it real to for someone who has experienced auditory hallucinations from my point of view, anyways.
Yeah, I listened to that also. That was really powerful because, someone like me who doesn't have schizophrenia doesn't understand how it sounds, what it looks like, how to deal with it. So it's really encouraging to see you just be out there and share your experience with regular people.
Yeah, thank you. I think the hardest thing for me to realize was that a lot of the people who didn't like my advocacy or didn't like that I was talking about schizophrenia were people who just really didn't understand the illness. And so that video was my way of trying to make it more attainable for people to like really understand like this is just one of the things I go through. And although auditory hallucinations are just a portion of my illness, it at least gives people a little bit of an insight to what it's like to live with this illness.
And to maybe describe, I guess what I heard listening to it was almost like it was three different tracks of people talking at the same time. Almost like our normal thought process, and then being invaded by different voices at different times, fragmented sentences, as well as critical self-criticism thrown in there as well. And then I think the three of them all together really made you feel that added sense of sheer confusion as well as the paranoia. And what I've worked with schizophrenic patients in the past. I've had a good amount of patients who have had psychotic episodes, and they look just everybody else, right? The speech is coming out the same. For the most part, mannerisms are somewhat, normal. And yet the things that they're saying are very abstract, sometimes convoluted, sometimes don't have a lot of association with really what's going on in front of us. And so just the empathy that I got from watching that really was how I wish that was something I learned in grad school, something I heard. I wish that's something I heard a long time ago to really give me that added empathy of working with clients. How accurate is that to what you actually experience in your head?
So the reason I used that one was because it was the closest thing I could find online to what I experience, and that's why I used it, but I did still add some of my own vocal tracks of some I added some of the things I hear regularly, and like you said, some of that can be self-criticism, but a lot of it can just be conversational too. So when I do tracks like that, and I've made different videos trying to show people what auditory hallucinations sound like, uh, I get a lot of questions because people are curious. They want to know more about it, and they want to know if it's always negative or it's always, scary. And I try to explain to people that my they've varied so much over the years that I've lived with this illness, and also, my experience is going to be very different than another person living with schizophrenia. And when I show those things, another person with schizophrenia might watch that and not have any familiarity to what I experience. For me, I do experience a lot of negative self-talk. I also will at times just experience very conversational. I try to explain it to people that like if you've ever been sitting in like a cafe and you're just sitting there. There's a bunch of people talking behind you. None of it has anything to do with you. I've literally had hallucinations like that where it's just like there's other conversations happening around me, and it differs. It really depends on what's going on in my life, what kind of stressors are happening. When I was using drugs as a way to cope with what I was going through, they were a lot darker. They were a lot scarier. And so, what's happening to me at any given time does impact, my symptoms and how those affect me. So it's really hard to try to show people that because I can only show a minute at a time, a couple minutes at a time. So the best thing I can do is keep making variations of not just simulations, but showing people. I have videos of me using my coping mechanisms to identify hallucinations. So, I have a service dog and I use my phone to identify visual hallucinations and stuff like that. Even like I would love to be able to show people what it's like to have visual hallucinations, but it's really hard to portray that on camera. Not only that, but even if I did it, people don't they're not gonna be able to understand the feelings that come along with that, and that's the same for auditory
Mhm.
hallucinations, I think. You hear it, and a lot of people are like, "Oh, man, I can't believe that. I wouldn't be able to deal with that if that was in my head." And I have to explain to people, "That's not in my head. Those are things I'm actually hearing. Like, it's a person sitting next to me, or it's a person down the hall." And I don't think people can conceptualize that if they've never
Yeah.
been through it. So, it's so hard to explain the emotions that come with that. It's confusion, I'm scared, I don't understand what's happening, and then in a very real sense, I believe it's real. I believe it's as real as the conversation I'm having with you guys right now. So, how do you convey that to people? And the best way I've been able to do that is just continuing to make videos and try to educate people about my illness.
Just one thing I wanted to touch on there. You mentioned checking the visual hallucinations with your phone. So, is this you have maybe a hallucination that you are seeing with your own eyes? Am I right? You might record
Yeah.
it and then take a look at your phone to see is I don't know reality matching what's being recorded.
Yeah, yeah, I've been
Wow.
doing this for
Wow.
years now, and those videos were really what led to my TikTok growing. So I started with just story times. I was just telling people about what it was like to live with hallucinations and delusions. But I had been using this coping mechanism for quite a while, and I decided one day, kind of on a whim, after having symptoms, to take one of these videos of me. I was at my office. I was starting a nonprofit. I was working alone late at night. I thought that I might be having symptoms. To this day, it's just I record all the time because I'm never really sure. There's a lot of delusion that comes with my hallucinations. So I decided to open up my phone, open up the camera, and I couldn't see the person I was talking to on my camera. So I knew that the person wasn't really there. That doesn't make the hallucinations go away, but it does get more of a grasp on reality. It helps ground me. It helps me identify that I am hallucinating and that I need to either call my wife or get to a safe place or get home. And I use this in my everyday life. I have videos of me using that in the airport, when I'm out in public, when I'm at the store. But it's helped me a lot feel more comfortable going out in public and being able to reintegrate back into like normal everyday life.
Now, when you do experience a visual or audio hallucination and you realize that it's a hallucination, do you then have to continue out the conversation, or is it just something you're like, okay, I know this isn't real. I know I don't need to respond anymore? Because I think that's what I'm really curious about with what
No,
you're
that's a
talking about.
super good question. Honestly, it depends on the level of delusion I'm having at that time because I've been medicated now for I'm going on 10 years since my diagnosis. I was diagnosed in 2015, right after I got out of jail, right when I got sober. And so I got this diagnosis. I got on antipsychotic medication, and my medication has changed a lot over the years. I'm at a point now where I'm very happy with my medication, but I still do occasionally have symptoms. And with that, the level of delusion or level of severity changes. Sometimes I'll just passively hear some auditory hallucinations and they pass and I go on with my day. Usually if I start having symptoms, it can get really serious really fast because it comes with, like I said, it comes with a lot of emotion. So if I get scared or if I get nervous or if I'm out in public, I get embarrassed. All of those emotions, level of delusion, and I know it's only making it harder for me, but I find it hard to stop the conversation. That being said, most of the time, I use my techniques like my phone or my service dog, and I'm able to recognize, hey, I'm hallucinating. I'm able to stop interacting, and the reason that's so important is because the more I interact, the harder it is for me to differentiate between what's real and what's not. The more I talk to a hallucination, the more it's like a real conversation that what I'm experiencing isn't real. So I try really hard to stop those conversations, but the unfortunate thing about schizophrenia is my mind is in control a lot of the time, and I'm not. So I do my best to learn new coping mechanisms, and I have a really good support team, and I have amazing caregivers like my wife, my mom, and so I have to rely heavily on other people too to help me in those moments with your issue. I'm trying to unlearn some of that.
Really allowing for support is one of, and also maybe giving up some control,
Yeah.
especially in those moments, can be really the hardest part in a lot of this. At least that's what I've seen with clients in the past. That you can have these amazing support systems, but then you also have to trust them. And then you also have to come to the acceptance of whatever's going on with you may not be as accurate or valid as you're feeling.
Yeah.
No. I gotta ask, who are the people that push back against this advocacy?
Um,
And what was that about? Yeah.
So I experienced early on, I experienced a lot of negativity. And I think part of it was people that didn't understand schizophrenia thought that I was faking it because I was functioning. So people see me functioning, they see me like living a quote unquote normal life. And their first thought is no one with schizophrenia could be living a normal life. It's not, their first thought isn't, oh, this person is functioning well with medication and using
Right.
coping mechanisms to be able to integrate himself back into society. Their first thought is he has to be faking because one minute he's hallucinating and the next minute he's very conversational and I articulate things very well. I'm well spoken. I motivational speaking is my full-time job. So when people meet me, a lot of people, if I didn't tell them that I had schizophrenia, they wouldn't know. And I think one of the issues people have had is there have been people on the internet who have used disorders and illnesses as a way to trick people into giving them money or giving them, and that sucks. And I think
Yeah.
it creates a lot of distrust and advocates like myself and advocates that are, especially like the one big one I can think of years ago, there was a Tourette's advocate who was found out to be lying. And so that really creates a lot of distrust now in the Tourette's advocate community. But there's a lot of people out there with Tourette's who still want to share about their illness and all that. So when I started making content, there was not a lot of schizophrenic content creators. And so when I came out doing this and people saw me, one minute I was posting a video having symptoms. A couple days later, I posted a video where I'm explaining it and I'm articulating and I'm communicating and educating really well. They so people who they just they don't like to see that someone who has been an addict who has been incarcerated is doing really well. I think
Yeah.
sometimes that just makes people mad that I had all of these issues and I'm, getting through them. And some people just don't like that. So there's a lot of read those comments to try to help educate and communicate why why they might be incorrect about their presumptions or their thoughts about my illness.
Good for you for pushing through and not letting that negativity really stop this. For most people, a lot of people, those negative comments and just that negativity can stop a good thing right in its tracks. Yeah. What has been, well, and I want to say this as well. When in reality, you're exactly what people need to see is someone who has learned these coping mechanisms, who has done the work, is compliant with their medication, has put
Yeah.
the support system in place, and that somebody with schizophrenia can lead a fairly normal life.
I think
Yeah, you speak
I
on that.
yeah, no, I think that's super important, and this is gonna sound super weird, but I tell people this, and this is not a joke. When I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, it felt like a death sentence, and the reason I say that, and I'm not exaggerating, is because I did not know it was possible to live a full and functional life with schizophrenia. The only person I knew with schizophrenia, besides what I had seen on movies or TV shows, was my mom, and she went misdiagnosed and undiagnosed for so long that it had a lot of irreversible cognitive damage. And I love my mom, but she was, she didn't get the results that I had with medication because she didn't get the help she needed early on. And it was because of her diagnosis that I got very early treatment, medication, access to, all of the things I needed. When I started this journey, I was not expecting to be at a point where I could have a conversation like this with you guys or be able to talk about what I had been through. I expected to be a little bit of a zombie the rest of my life at best. At worst, I expected that I would fall back into addiction or end up incarcerated like so many other people with schizophrenia
Yeah.
or end up homeless because people with schizophrenia make up a lot of the homelessness rate. So it's just, I think it was really disheartening at first. And it really showed me how little people knew about schizophrenia because when I came out and they saw me doing well, they didn't at all think that was because I was on medication or treatment. They thought it was because I was faking. I think that says a lot about the illness and the stigma
Yeah, it
around
does.
it and what people think about it. So I think that's so important. And another thing is like, now that I've done this work, I know dozens of schizophrenia advocates who are just like me or even doing better in their lives. Like I know Carlos Larari is a person living with schizophrenia who he went back to school to become a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And he even that wasn't enough for him. He just went back and passed the bar so he could practice law. And like
Wow.
there are
And
people
change policy maybe or
yeah,
something
yeah.
like
So
that.
there are
Yeah,
people with
yeah. Wow.
schizophrenia that like no one would know are living these amazing functional lives because worries
Yeah.
about people with schizophrenia that ever get shared are negative, or God forbid someone did something horrible because of a delusion or hallucination. Everyone will hear about those stories. They won't hear about like the me and the Carlos and Michelle Hammer and all these amazing schizophrenia advocates who are making it. And we're fighting against that stigma,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Wow.
One of the other things that may be a stigma against people with schizophrenia is I've heard a lot of people say that it's brought on by the use of drugs.
Yep.
But I believe from the videos that you've been putting out that it's just something that develops in early adulthood with or without drugs. Can you clear that up for me a little bit?
Yes, I think people get really confused with this because there's a lot of studies coming out that drug use increases your chances of developing a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. That is fact. That is true. But what they're not taking into conception is like a lot of people use drugs once they develop an illness because that's how they cope with it. And that's not the right way to cope with it, but that's what I did. I was not an active drug user when my symptoms started. I started having paranoid thoughts, and then that quickly led to hallucinations and delusions. And my way of trying to deal with that was instead of reaching out or asking for help, was to use drugs and alcohol. And unfortunately, now that I am an advocate and I talk to patients all over the country, that is way more common than I wish it was. And the truth of the matter is, yes, you can increase your chances of developing a psychotic disorder by using hard drugs. And that's full stop. That is factual. But there are a lot of other environmental factors that go into that. Genetics plays a role in that. So there's a lot of things that, we could point a finger at a lot of different things besides drugs that also increase your chances. But that's what people tend to use. And I get it. Like they want people to understand there is a risk to using drugs, and I'm not here to advocate for drugs at all. But But I want to make it clear, like, that is not the only factor going into
Yeah.
someone developing, schizophrenia. There's a lot that can happen, and we
Yeah.
still don't know. Like, scientists to this day still don't 100% know the cause of schizophrenia. So to come out and claim that is, in my mind, that's crazy. And that's coming from
Yeah.
a person with schizophrenia. I think that's crazy to just come out and claim that.
Would you say genetics is probably the most likely, I don't know,
Even
determining factor?
genetics, I mean, even
Okay.
genetics, like, the crazy thing about schizophrenia and psychosis and any disorder that revolves around, psychosis, it's it's just so out there because my mom has schizophrenia, and she had 3 kids. Only one of us developed schizophrenia, So it's even that, I'm like, the studies are out there that show, like, even genetics plays a role, but doesn't determine whether or not someone will develop a disorder. Now, that being said, I had the genetics and a lot of environmental factors. I went through abuse as a child. I went through different trauma. Stuff like that definitely contributed to me likely developing my illness, but I can't prove any of that. That's all based on what
Yeah.
I've seen from studies, based on what I've experienced in my own life. It's very what causes schizophrenia. In my lifetime, we can get more of an idea of, the actual cause, whether it's genetics, whether it is a very specific environmental fact. As of right now, all we can really do is speculate and try to help people see some of the causation and correlation.
Do you think that drugs is probably one of the biggest things that separates people who end up having a more successful, or I guess normal trajectory type life versus those
I think it can definitely it's really
like,
challenging because if someone starts using drugs as a way to cope, a lot of those people might get written off as druggies instead of people with a psychotic
yeah,
disorder or with a
yeah,
psychiatric disorder, right? So in my own case, I was looked at as a person committing crimes before I was looked at as a person with a psychotic disorder. Because drug addiction in, the US is a crime, and everything about that made my lifestyle criminal. I did go to jail, I did serve time for that stuff, but it prevented me from getting a diagnosis early on. And once you're a part of the criminal justice system, it's very hard to get a diagnosis. So while I was in jail is actually the first time I reached out for help. And while I was incarcerated, I was basically turned away several times. The COs thought that I was just trying to get out of my cell. They wouldn't set it up so that I could speak to anyone. I was basically denied, the opportunity to get a diagnosis, speak to a psychiatrist. So it wasn't until I was let out of jail that I actually got to do that and receive the care I needed. And I can't tell you the amount of people I was incarcerated with that definitely
yeah,
were in need of mental health care and not in need of a jail cell. Like, so many people I was incarcerated with were either undiagnosed with mental illness or struggling addicts. Very few people I met were bad people. And I want to be clear, those people are there. Like, I'm not saying we don't need jails or prisons. There are genuine, like, bad people out there, but a majority of the people in our prison system are either undiagnosed with mental illness, diagnosed with mental illness and don't have access to care, homeless, or struggling addicts. And that's
yeah.
100% what I experienced while I was incarcerated.
Our prisons are really just
They've basically become
terribly
institutions.
run psych
Yeah.
hospitals that,
Uh,
don't offer any sort of treatment. And it's just infuriating. It really, I'm such an advocate for prison reform. And this is something right here, just getting the access while you're there would reduce the recidivism, and it just helps so many people with one visit, 2 visits. Yeah, that makes my blood boil a little
yeah.
to
Well, and
know
that's
that. Yeah.
and you mentioned it there too. The recidivism rate for people struggling with mental illness is incredibly high because if you
Yeah.
can't get access to the care you need, you're not gonna be okay when you get out. You're gonna definitely end up going back. And unfortunately, that also comes into like poverty because if you have access to the medication, some people do get help while they're inside. They get a diagnosis, they get medication, then they get out and they can't afford that medication anymore. Where are they gonna go? What are they gonna do?
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah.
people just end up back in. And not only do we have to focus on, like, the prison system, we have to focus on people having resources when they get out too, because a lot that they are, either hallucinating or delusional. And for them to not have access to care is what's keeping them at that point. And some of them get so unwell they don't think they need care, and that's where I was. Like, I didn't
Yeah.
think that I had
Oh,
schizophrenia. You couldn't have convinced me that I had schizophrenia, and that's even coming from someone who was a caregiver for my mother with schizoaffective disorder. So delusion outweighs reality, and if
yeah.
I don't have access to care, I'm never gonna seek it. So it's really frustrating from every end, not just in the but when
Yeah.
people get out, they still don't have those resources.
Yeah.
It's
It's
so
okay.
sad.
Yeah. I mean, do you think I'm really curious, understand the motivation that you have to take care of this and to push on and to create,
That's what I was just going to ask.
to become an entrepreneur. And it's so impressive. Like, you really are the real heroes out there that have this immense resilience, and then to show others what's possible, even in the face of about as severe of a mental illness as there is. Do you think part of that was upbringing in having to see, what untreated schizophrenia looks like? Yeah. I don't know. What are some of your core drives that have pushed you here?
I think there was a lot that went into it. The first thing was watching my mom go without the help she needed, right? Because I slowly watched her deteriorate. I watched her mind slip, and without the right help, without early intervention, like, that has irreversible cognitive damage. And so she doesn't get to have the stability that I have today because no one knew what was going on. And when we asked questions, we were basically met with the idea of, we don't talk about those things. And that was so frustrating. And so we've gotten better in the last, my mom was diagnosed when I was a teenager. We're talking, over a decade ago easily, because I've been diagnosed for a decade. So even in the amount of time since she was diagnosed or I was diagnosed, there's been a lot of improvements to, access to care, to people recognizing and addressing mental health and mental illness. But that being said, we're still falling very short, and a lot of people aren't getting the care they need. The biggest thing for me after watching my mom go through her issues was just feeling really alone in my own journey. And the thing that got me through was peer support. So I found a local mental health peer support group in my area right after I was diagnosed. I did not want to go. I refused to go. My wife, God bless her soul, she she kept pushing me. She was like, "Hey, you have this diagnosis, you have medication now, but I can tell you're still struggling. Maybe it would help to talk to someone." And I went in, and my mind was very set. I walked into that room and I was hearing other people talk. And for the first couple minutes, I was like, these people are crazy. I'm not like these people. That's what I thought. And
Yeah.
literally sitting there with a schizophrenia diagnosis, hallucinating. And I'm like, these people are crazy. I'm nothing like them.
Mm.
And as I kept going back to peer support group, I didn't talk for a long time, but I was hearing stories, and I started to identify, like, with other people, because I was hearing like, oh, this person experienced addiction because of the symptoms they were having. This person went to jail. Like, this person has the same diagnosis as me, and the symptoms they talk about are a lot like my symptoms. And all of the sudden, I felt less alone, and that really inspired me, and it made me want to give that to other people. So, like, I can't say enough about peer support group. I really think peer support saved my life, because I really think, like, I would have maybe stayed on medication, but I wouldn't have lived a life of uh, trying to pursue things. Like I said, I didn't know that was possible. And when I went to these meetings, I was like, wait, this guy has schizophrenia and he drives, he goes to work. Like, I was told that I couldn't do those things. You mentioned it when we started. I just wrote a book about mental illness and mental health in the workplace, and it's called Minds Over Medians. And the reason I wrote it was because 2 weeks after I was diagnosed, I was just getting on medication. I was starting to get some clarity from medication. And my memory of that point in my life is still very spotty. But one thing I do remember was I went to a doctor who was not my primary care doctor. It was just, went in for something unrelated. He saw that I had just been diagnosed with undifferentiated schizophrenia, and he asked me if I was on disability. And I said no. And he said, well, you should be, because you are never going to work again. And that wasn't a question. That was a statement he made. And so that's why I felt so
This
obligated.
was a psychiatrist?
No, it was a doctor. It was no one
Okay. Just the
involved.
primary.
My
Yeah.
psychiatrist is amazing. I've had the same psychiatrist since I was diagnosed, and I just happened to be with another doctor who was not my primary, and they told me that. They said, "You will never work again."
It's got
And
to be really disheartening.
Oh, yeah, yeah, and like I said, when I went to peer support, I was like, "Wait, there are people in here with mental illness that are working." Granted, there were people in there that weren't too, but they didn't have early care, they didn't have the stability and clarity that I was getting from medication, and I got to a point where I was feeling really good on medication. I was like, "Why couldn't I do this?" And over the last 10 years, I've worked in a ton of different industries, and I wanted to write that book just so I could bring a copy to that doctor, and I brought him a signed copy of that book, and I was like, "Hey, turns out people with schizophrenia can work if they get the right help and resources."
Good for you. That's amazing. What a great story.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the insights in the book?
I think the main thing for me was, I wanted to communicate that there is, responsibility both for the person who is struggling and for employers. So half of the book is for people who might be struggling with not just schizophrenia, any mental health or mental illness, because it's important to remember that anyone can struggle with mental health, not just people with severe mental illness. Situations can come up in anyone's life that causes them to experience sadness, depression, anxiety, burnout, and so I put some different ways that I've been able to cope, especially if you have a diagnosis, ways that you can ask for resources or reasonable accommodations, things that you can use, knowing your rights as a worker. But then the second half of the book is really set up for leaders, HR, people who are employing individuals who want to try to hold on to good employees instead of letting them go the minute they might have something come up with their mental health, and really trying to help them understand why it's beneficial to keep an employee instead of going through constant turnover, trying to find a person who never struggles, when the fact is, like, we all can struggle and a lot of us do at some point in our lives. So I wanted to make the book really for everyone. Anyone who wants to, better understand their own mental health, anyone who wants to understand, disorders like schizophrenia, and anyone who is just an employer or someone providing those jobs. I just wanted it to be for, like, anyone who, yeah, I can't tell you the amount of times that, I hear that, "Oh, people with schizophrenia don't wanna work." And then I go to in and outpatient facilities all over the country and I talk to patients. And I'll tell you what, the number one question they ask me is, how can I work? How can I hold a job? I don't want to be on disability. It's just all I feel like I can do because no one's given me a chance. And
Yeah.
so I was amazed because I thought that was just me. Everyone made it sound like people with schizophrenia just didn't want to work and they wanted to be on disability. And when I started talking to patients, I was like, "Oh, that is not the case. They want to work, they just don't know how to go about it. They don't know where to start. They don't know what industries would be good because there are industries that might not be the best for someone who's actively hallucinating." One of my first jobs, I was operating a forklift. Probably not the best idea, right?
Scary.
Uh, yeah, so, like, it got to a point where I was like, "Yeah, I might have to consider looking at a different job or different industry," and helping, patients understand that, I think, is huge. And my wife, who is actually on the autism spectrum, I share a little bit of her story in there too. She worked a lot of jobs that it just didn't fit well for what she experienced. And once we started looking into jobs that, people with autism do better in, roles where they're not customer facing, roles where they can really take time to decompress and not go through meltdowns or burnout, she did really well. And so I recognize that it's not just mental health, it's not just mental illness, it's not just developmental disabilities. The workplace needs to be more accommodating for anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For our audience out there, do you have some favorite skills, concepts, coping mechanisms that you might be able to share to either the men or young men that we're really speaking to a lot too?
Specifically to the workplace or just in general with mental health?
Both. Yeah.
In the workplace, I think the best thing you can do, and probably the hardest thing you can do, is communicate. And so, like, now, I work for myself now, but in my last few roles, one of the hardest things I had to do, and this is actually how I start the book. I start the book by talking about going into an employer and disclosing to them that I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I talked about how scary it was. And I talked about how no joke, I thought I was going to be fired. Like, I had packed up everything in my locker and I thought as soon as I told them this, they were going to let me go. And what they did instead was they told me about all of the company's mental health resources and they tried to help me get on, they gave me the contact information for their EAP, which is the employee assistance program. And all of a sudden, I had all these resources that I didn't know I just needed to ask for. So I think as hard as it is, communication can be really effective in the workplace. And unfortunately, that's not going to be every workplace, but if a workplace isn't understanding, it might be time to find a better place for you, a place that will accommodate you. And so for me, that was the biggest thing in everyday life. Education, I think, is a huge thing. Like me understanding my illness gave me a lot more freedom. It gave me the ability to forgive myself. One of the things I tell people is schizophrenia is often only associated with hallucinations and delusions and paranoia. What people forget is there's two other symptom domains, negative and cognitive symptoms. And all of those things I was experiencing, I thought were a fault of my own. Some of the things in there are like issues with memory, inability to take care of yourself, inability to communicate and talk about all of these things I wasn't doing. There was days I couldn't get up and brush my teeth. I had really bad hygiene for a while, and I thought it was all my fault until I got on medication where I was feeling I was like, "Oh, I wasn't choosing to do this. I'm not lazy like everyone told me I was." And I didn't even know that those were part of my illness. And so understanding that, educating myself about my illness helped me a lot. So that's what I would usually recommend.
Yeah, the communication piece is so key. I
Yeah.
just had a friend who went through something, and um, the second she was able to open up to her friends, it was like, all right, all hands on deck. We're
Yeah.
getting this handled. We all got to give her the resources that she needed, got her in, got her out, nipped it in the bud. And it's almost remarkable how big of a turnaround she was able to make. And it all came from once she stopped, once she was able to open up and really reach out for help.
Yeah. And
And
that
that's
is
really like the basis of our whole podcast here.
Yeah,
Is
and that is a hard thing to do. I don't wanna downplay that.
right.
That's coming from someone who I held it down for so long. I was like, "I'm not gonna talk about this. I'm not gonna make this everyone else's issue," because that's how I was raised. That's what I was taught. And so once I started doing it, I was like, "Man, life is so much easier when I'm willing to ask for help. Life is way more livable when I'm able to get the resources I need." And there's no shame in that. And it was weird for me to like go through that because you think someone would tell you that when you're younger, but a lot of the time I was, made to feel guilty for having different feelings or emotions. So when I went through the worst of my issues and I was on the brink of not being alive anymore, I really didn't expect to have such an overwhelming amount of support when I finally did communicate my needs.
That shame is a hell of an emotion. It's there for a reason, right? It keeps us in check, it keeps us in the tribe, but it can also weigh a little extra heavy and keep us from getting the help we want a lot of
Yeah.
times. So,
Well, Kody, I know we don't have you for a long time for the evenings. Let me just ask you, how can people like Ryan and I and our listeners help support your advocacy work? Because it's so important to spread the word. Your story sounds very similar to mine, where I had to deal with some mental health issues and I went to therapy and I found a community to support me. And the difference that made for me was so huge. And it's actually what motivated us to create this podcast. So, first of all, thank you. And second of all, how do we help?
I would say one thing is keep going with this because this is so important I'm grateful to share my story, but too often I recognize that people are hearing my story and they think that this is what schizophrenia is. This is specifically in my advocacy. Literally watching videos, sharing videos, stuff like that can be huge for me to reach people that I haven't reached before because my journey with advocacy is really to reach everyone. I want everyone to see my message in case they are like I was, living in a small rural area where they feel alone and no one could understand what they're going through. Not everyone has. You just mentioned peer support helped you a lot. That's what helped you through your journey. Not everyone has or even knows that peer support is an option. And so for those people, I want them to know there are online advocates, there are online resources, there are online peer support groups that they can find if they need it. And another thing for just anyone out there who wants to, uh, you know, change the way people think about mental health and mental illness, share your own story if you're able to. I always add if you're able to, because I know not everyone's in a position where they can. But if you are able to share your story, it helps people so much to have a different perspective. Not everyone's going to be able to identify with my story or the way that I cope, because One of the things I noticed is when I started using humor and comedy, not everyone loved that. A lot of people are still in a very raw place in their own journey where they aren't in a place to laugh about it. And I understand that. And that's completely fine. So not everyone's going to be able to, watch me and, feel a connection with me or my content, but they might with someone else who's listening right now who hasn't shared their story. So a lot can be done by more people getting out there and taking the plunge into. You don't even have to be an advocate full time, but let people know that it's normal to feel the way they're feeling, or can get people a long way. That's what saved my life too.
Well,
Amazing.
I know that's really good definitely for me to hear. I think probably for both Sky and I to hear. Both of us have a interesting origin story that has brought us here today. And I know, just like you were saying, shame really gets in the way of me sharing that story. Next week is something I call my Alive Day, where I somehow miraculously, through the grace of God and crazy physics, am still here to talk about it. And it's the thing that started my journey to become a therapist and to help people from ever getting to the point that I got to. And so thank you for that personally.
Yeah,
Appreciate that.
of course.
Yeah, I need that push.
Kody, where can people find you on social media, and where can they buy your book?
So if you want to check out my book, it's called Minds Over Meetings. It's available on Barnes and Noble, Amazon, and my website. My website is kodygreen.com, Kody with a K. And you can find all of my speaking engagements on there, as well as the book and some other resources. I also am on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all of which are under the username Schizophrenic Hippie. There is a backstory to that username. So for anyone who doesn't know, my backstory with that is it was actually my very first hate comment. So I have very long hair. I have a full beard. And when I've made my very first video about schizophrenia, someone commented, they said, why would I listen to a schizophrenic hippie? And I just was like, hey, that's kind of catchy. So I took it and made it my username about 5 years ago, and it just stuck. So that's where you can, if you want to find me, Schizophrenic Hippie on all platforms. And that is the story to that name.
Man, I love that you've been able to take all this negativity and all this hate and turn it right on its head and make something of it. It's so damn cool. I'm so impressed. It's
Thank
awesome.
you. I almost feel
I
like
also
I
think
owe that guy something, right? Like at this point, I'm like,
Nope.
do I owe him like some sort of stipend for that?
That's funny. In one of your comedy acts that I watched, you said something really funny that stuck with me. And I think if people watch you, I think they'll see that you have really amazing humor. And it was, if you don't laugh at me, at least my hallucinations will.
I love that one.
So thank you for sharing it. And thank you so
Yeah.
much for being on the show today, Kody. It really means so much to us and the listeners that you took the time to be here and to really share your story, because being authentic and sharing who you are and being vulnerable is really what this podcast is all about. It's all about helping men realize that they can talk about their mental health problems and have a support group around them and be safe. So thank you so much for your advocacy work.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was pretty special. Thank you so much, Kody. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. What another great episode of Hey Man, It's Okay. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, follow us on all social media at Hey Man, It's Okay, and check out our website, heymanitsokay.com. And you can find all of Kody's info there on the information page. And we'll make sure to share all of his links with you guys on our website. So thanks for stopping by.
Thank you guys for coming down. Yeah, comment, subscribe. Appreciate it. Thanks,
And
Kody.
until next time, it's okay to not be okay. Thanks, everybody.